Alright, so howdy everyone and welcome back. My name is Avram Plager, and this is my first video after a long time being away. Bit of explanation, so I recently started college and last semester was very hectic, so I wasn't able to post any videos. But this semester my schedule is a lot more free, so I'll be posting a few more videos. I've been checking my comments, throughout the year, and it's really awesome to see how this channel's grown, even if I haven't been posting videos. So I thank everybody who subscribed to my channel, has been watching my videos, and just been supporting the channel. This is a big dream of mine to really teach my skills and pass on the knowledge that I've had throughout the years. So with that, this episode is just going to be on the basics of rendering. We're just going to be using Blender for right now. In future tutorials, I'll be going into how to use rendering in SolidWorks. And SolidWorks does have a different engine for rendering, but for now we're just going to stay in Blender because it is my favorite application to do rendering in. So with that, there's the entry page for all Blender files that you're going to do. What you're going to do from here is open the tab over to the left, and if you scroll your mouse over to the top left, you'll see your mouse becomes this kind of plus sign here. You're going to want to click and drag, and it'll open up a new tab here. Now you have two tabs that you can use. You can either choose the left or the right one to go into your rendering options. So you're going to want to go to editor type. Editor type is over by the top left. It looks like a grid with a little circle on it. That is going to be what type of page you're opening up. So when you open that up, you'll get a list of options here. We'll go into detail about what all these mean in future tutorials, but for now all we're going to be concerned with is the shader editor. So in the shader editor, what you're going to see is this tab here. You're going to have a principled BSDF shader and a material output. What you want to do to give yourself a little bit of room is press N on your keyboard. That'll close that little pane here. If you want to open it up again, you can press N and it'll open it up again. So I like to keep that closed because I don't find much use for it most of the time, but you can keep it open if you want. What you're going to want to do before you start rendering is go up to your tab over here, and you'll see a little camera looking icon. Your render engine is going to be what type of rendering you're doing. So Eevee is a basic rendering engine. You won't get much detail in that, but you can use it for previewing your textures and what everything's going to look like before you actually start doing something more resource intensive on your computer. So I like to use Eevee just to begin with, and then the other option you're going to use is Cycles. I actually have never used Workbench. I personally don't know how to use it, but if y'all want, I can do a tutorial on that, and I can see how to use it and then teach y'all how to use it myself. So Workbench, ignore that for now. Use Eevee when you're just starting out, and then Cycles for all of your actual rendering work. So we'll just use Eevee for now. You can click on that. Sampling is going to say how detailed your render is. So with Eevee, you really never need to go above 64 in your render, and I would set this to about 50. In Eevee, you don't really want to have too much of a drastic change between your viewport and your render, just because the end result isn't going to be very high quality no matter what. So your viewport is going to be 50. So if you want to change your rendering options, you can either go up to this top bar here, and there's a slot over to the right that shows a bunch of different circles. So these are your viewing options. So you have wireframe, you have your normal, which is your solid, you have a viewport shading, and I'll explain what that is later in the tutorial, and then you have rendered. So rendered is what you're going to want to go into. So in rendered, you can see it looks like it's actually a physical object. See the difference between solid and rendered here. So there you go. And in rendered, you do have to pay attention. The lighting is not consistent throughout the entire workspace like it is in solid. In rendered, you have this light here. That is why Blender always opens up with a camera and a light bulb is because this is where your light source is going to be for your render. So when you start rendering, you're going to want to pay attention to this light source, and we can change our select mode to just general select mode, and then we can move our light source around, and you can see as we move our light source around, it starts lighting up different portions of the box. So when we're using our rendering, that light source is going to come in real handy. So with that, we'll actually get into starting to make textures on our block. So with that, you're going to want to make this page as tiny as possible because you're going to have this space where you're going to be working. So you're going to want to zoom in a little bit. You can see the first slot we have is base color. In base color, you can change the RGB value of your block. So RGB, of course, you can have red value, green value, blue value, and then your A is your darkness of that color. HSV is slightly different, and then you have a hex code. So for RGB, of course, if we take down our G and our B, it's a completely red shape. And if we take down our R, since we only have one color, taking that down is automatically going to decrease the light value. So if we want green and blue, if we take down that red, it's not necessarily going to take down that light value until it gets below the highest point. So since our blue is our highest point, it's going to decrease that light value until we hit our blue, and then it's just going to decrease the amount of red we have in the object. With the A, you can control the color of the transparency, so how transparent your object is going to be. So if you want your object to be completely transparent, you can do that, but I usually don't find a purpose for that. So blue and green, of course, if we have all of our red, green, and blue values all the way up, it's going to create a white box. If we have all of our red, green, and blue values down, it's going to create a black box. So if you want just kind of a normal like greenish color, I like to usually use some of the other colors just because having a flat green just is too sharp sometimes. I mean, if you do want a sharp green, then you can, but I usually like adding a little bit of red and blue, and you can see it's a little bit of a softer green, and it's a nicer green to look at. So that's how I do with all my colors. Of course, do red, take down the green and blue. If you're doing blue, just take down the red and green. See, it's a nice blue color. So that's how you operate in the RGB environment. For HSV, of course, the A is still going to be your transparency, but again, don't use it. I don't. So your H is going to be the radians around your circle here. So of course, if you have 0, it's going to go to that 0 spot. If you have 1, it's going to go there. So if you have, of course, 0.5, it's going to be halfway around the circle, and so that radius is just going to control where that little dot that indicates where your color is. S is going to be the radius that you have. So if you want, more white color or more dulled color, you can use S, and then you can change the actual color it's using with H. If you want to change the darkness of that color, you go to V, and that changes the darkness of the color. Personally, I like using HSV over RGB because it definitely gives you a lot more control over the color. And then of course you have hex codes. Hex codes are good if you want, say, a specific color like turquoise. You can look up the hex code for turquoise online, copy, paste that into the box here, and that'll be the color that you have. Of course, you can just mess around with this code. It's 6 digits, and it's numbers and letters. So if we have, AAA there, it's gonna be a gray color, and that can change with whatever notes you put in. And this is more for the machine. It's not really meant for people to understand. If you want to look up the more intricacies on how this hex code plays out into colors, you can. I haven't put much thought into it because it's not much to stress about. But moving on from your base color, the subsurface, all of that, I have never found any use for. But the one thing that is going to play a big part in objects that you make is going to be metallic. So metallic obviously is going to detail how metallic your object is. With metallic, you never want to go to 100% because then it looks just fake. So I usually like to use around 0.73 or 0.98. So that's going to be your metallic. Of course, if you want a completely non-metallic object, you're going to go to 0. Fully metallic, go just a little bit below 1. Alright, so specular. Specular details how strongly this shape is affected by other shapes in the light. So, of course, if you take that all the way down, it's pretty standardized lighting around the shape. If you put that all the way up, it's more generalized, and you can kind of see, at least in cycles, once you switch over, you'll be able to see some of the effects of other objects onto this shape. So specular, I'll go more into detail in future tutorials, but that's just generally how specular works. Roughness, of course, is going to be how rough the surface of your object is. So 0 is going to be completely smooth, and then 1 is going to be completely rough. Of course, you can see that the less rough your object is, the less light affects it directly. So if you have it all the way rough and you create a completely black shape, it is going to be completely black. And if you turn the roughness all the way up, the light can affect it. You can't necessarily see this in Eevee as well as you can in cycles, but as I said, Eevee is just a kind of prototyping rendering engine. So for the rest of these values, I do really need to go into cycles to really see the effect of those, so I'll go into cycles for a moment. In cycles, you can see we have a lot more options, and generally what I recommend is using the supported feature set. And then for your device, if you have a graphics processing unit, go to GPU compute. It renders a lot faster and a lot better. In cycles, you don't necessarily have a samples that it's going to render at. It's going to have a max samples and a min samples. So for max samples, of course, that's going to be crazy high because it's going to keep trying to render as much as it can. For min samples, I usually like to use about 200. In cycles, it really does a lot more, so you're going to want a lot more samples for what you're rendering. Don't use denoise in your viewport because that's going to take a lot more time and effort from your computer to something that you really don't need to see right here when you're doing textures. But in your render, definitely have that denoise tab on. There's options in the denoise that you can use, but usually I just like to use whatever preset settings Blender has because those work very well. Of course, for your render, you're going to need to set a min and max samples. But for min samples, I would say set that to 300 for right now. That gives you a good bit of samples to work with. So now we can actually look at what these colors really do. So we're going to set our V up a little bit so we can see a little bit more colors. We'll take this a little bit to red. Of course, if you're using this, you can just take this white dot and move it around wherever you want to create some random color. And now in cycles, we can go into here and we can take our metallic all the way down, take our roughness down a little bit. So now we'll take our metallic, if we want, we'll make a metallic shape. So take this down to a white and we'll set the roughness up a little bit. Metallic all again down to say 0.98. That's good. And then we'll go over to our anisotropic. Anisotropic details how light bends around the object. So what you'll see this effect most on is, say, machined metal. So if you look at machined metal, you'll notice the light bends kind of in an arc and it goes to a point wherever the machine kind of started its radius on. So that anisotropic really gives you that kind of effect on the object. So the light really affects it in an odd way with the anisotropic and in a nice way too. I honestly like using this for most of my metal objects. For roughness, of course, that anisotropic really tends to go away if you use the extremes of your roughness. So a really smooth metal might not have that as much. Then your sheen really doesn't do very much. I honestly just like using roughness because that gives me a little bit better control, and it definitely looks a lot better than sheen. So that's that. With a specular, again, you can kind of see the effects of specular a lot more in cycles. And so that's what I'm going to cover today. That is the principled BSDF shader. There's a lot more in this rendering tab, and I'm very excited to make future videos on that. But again, with that is the basics of rendering with just using this one type of shader. And I hope this was really good. Please let me know in the comments anything you'd like to have, and I will work on creating something and work on really listening to y'all and getting your video recommendations in. I know there's a lot of video recommendations that I have to go through, and so yeah, with that, that's all I have today, and I hope y'all have a great day.